Welcome to the fifth and final section of my Obama and Russia video series. This time we're going to be covering the 2016 presidential election and Russia's interference in that election. We're going to talk about Clinton, we're going to talk about Trump, we're going to talk about Putin, all the highs, all the lows, all the hits, all the unprecedented, right here in under an hour. So I do have to say, this video does have a little bit of difference in the background. I have some new research assistants, some new little buddies here. So this is Ram, and this is Beam. So they were very new but very helpful in this video, so do give them some props for the effort they put into the research. Just as a reminder, the other 4 parts in this series are all available on this channel and cover all the lead up to this pretty much, right? So the end of the USSR and the expansion of a US-led liberal world system in the 1990s, part 1. Early attempts between the US and Russia at bilateral cooperation, so that's Obama's first term. Faltering cooperation in Syria, so that's video number 3. That's mostly Obama's second term. And the ratcheting up of tensions concerning Ukraine after 2014. So that's Obama's second term and the 4th video in the series. In turning to the part Russia played in the 2016 election, we are essentially viewing the headstone atop the grave of Obama's Russia reset. The perhaps inevitable result of trying to solve with discrete policy compromises a disagreement that goes right down to the fundamentals. Right? There's just some things that the US and Russia, as they are currently constituted, cannot get past, no matter how much bilateral cooperation they attempt. Remember, sources and additional information are in the description below, so if you want to research a point that I make further, or dispute it, or whatever you want to do, make sure you check out where I'm getting my information from, and then if you have a correction or an amendment, post it in the comments with your own citation. Let's go.
Now, Mr. Spock.
Russia and the 2016 U.S. election. Section 1. Background on election interference. Election interference is nothing new. Really, as long as there have been elections, whether nobles choosing a new king of Poland, or citizens choosing who they'd prefer the Electoral College elevate to the US presidency, who gets to hold powerful office interests people and institutions beyond the immediate electoral environment. Sometimes that interest turns into action as people try to turn events in their favor. This could manifest as domestic interference, like the KKK suppressing Reconstruction-era Southern voters. Sometimes that's external. Foreign powers have many options when it comes to influencing the behaviors of other countries. Hegemons like the US can engage in anything from a strongly worded diplomatic communique up to an invasion. Lesser great powers like the United Kingdom or France might be able to pressure regional neighbors with diplomacy or even limited military force, but wouldn't be able to project that power across the globe. Even for the United States, which has the military option always in its back pocket, other means are usually preferred, because force is expensive, controversial, high-profile, and risky. As we've seen with Iraq, regime change is not an easy path, so working within a target country's established political institutions is often a far more common tactic. Now, great powers generally turn to election interference specifically when 3 conditions are present. Number 1, the great power believes that its interests are imperiled by a significant candidate or party in the target country. 2, a given election looks like it's going to be a close race and could thus benefit from an outsider tipping the scales. 3, there's a domestic actor within the target nation desirous of outside assistance. Without the first two conditions, other diplomatic or military means will likely be pursued, as the expense and risk of election interference aren't perceived to be necessary or effective. Without the third condition, a great power will usually refrain from interfering in an election even when it feels threatened. Because without the local expertise of a colluding agent, the probability of success collapses, prompting policymakers to turn to other means. Broadly speaking, there are two ways to interfere in an election: overtly and covertly. Either the target country and electorate know an outside power is exerting influence, or they don't. Both types of intervention carry risk. Overt operations can blow back if voters in the target country feel they're being strong-armed, for instance. But because overt operations allow for more extensive electoral manipulation, they often yield a higher chance of success. Covert operations carry lower risk, but are also often less effective, because they need to balance providing sufficient assistance against the need to remain clandestine. This significantly hampers what a covert operation can accomplish. Now, most interventions are covert in nature because local politicians don't want to be seen as pawns of foreign powers, and even a substantial minority of overt operations have covert components. Now, within these two broad categories, there are many specific tactics and methods that can be employed. The most common tactic is campaign funding, and about 2/3 of interference operations have included giving money to the preferred candidate. Other tactics include dirty tricks, like dissemination of scandalous information, property damage, or spying; campaigning assistance, like beefing up local electoral abilities via training or voter turnout techniques; threats or promises, so these would be public and specific utterances by an official of the great power promising concrete positive or negative action. This is a really common one that we see in overt operations. The giving and taking of aid, so trade deals, foreign aid, loans, material assistance, is provided or revoked during an election cycle, and then overtly linked to the policies of the favored candidate. Other concessions might include agreements tied to local conditions, like a great power evacuating a military base. On average, intervention efforts increase the vote share of the preferred side by about 3%. This doesn't sound like much, but it would have been enough to sway the popular vote in 7 of the last 16 presidential elections. The major exception is founding elections, that is to say, elections held by newly minted democracies. In founding elections, interventions typically damage the aided side, reducing predicted mean vote share by an average of nearly 7%. Section 2. Election interference in the U.S. context. The 2016 election cycle was often characterized as unprecedented because of Russian interference operations, but this isn't the first presidential election to prompt foreign action. In at least 5 prior elections, foreign powers have attempted to meddle in the outcome. Revolutionary France, Great Britain, Nazi Germany, or the Soviet Union used both covert and overt means to influence the outcome. Nazi Germany tried to prevent FDR from winning a third term in 1940 by leaking Polish documents painting him as a warmonger. During the 1968 presidential election against Nixon, Hubert Humphrey was approached by the Soviets, offering him money, although he rejected their offer. Now, the United States wasn't merely the innocent recipient of such actions. Given its long history of foreign intervention, whether conquering Indian nations, intervening in the Mexican Revolution, or sending gunboats to South America, it should not surprise us that during the 20th century, U.S. policymakers of both major parties added election interference to their foreign policy toolkit. The Cold War average for electoral operations was 1.35 times per year for the Democrats and 1.37 times for the Republicans. Moreover, This tactic was used far more frequently by the United States than its primary adversary during that time. Of the 117 partisan electoral interventions orchestrated by either the US or the USSR/Russia between January 1946 and December 2000, US operatives prosecuted 69% of these.
Nice.
Focusing primarily in Asia and Latin America. Within this context, we should not be surprised that either Russia or the US continues to meddle in the internal affairs of other countries. As Bill Clinton's Deputy Secretary of State wrote, reflecting on the US intervention in Yugoslavia, quote, "The sovereignty of individual states is not absolute. A national government that systematically and massively abuses its own citizens loses its right to govern. It is subject either to being put out of business altogether or having its authority suspended in that area of the country where it is running amok." Of course, it was up to US officials to determine when something was amok, what counted as a sovereignty-negating abuse. Section 3. The geopolitical context leading up to 2016. So let's start with the general failure of the Russia reset. Bilateral cooperation with regard to things like strategic and deployed nuclear arms, Iran's nuclear project, and trade could not make up for fundamental disagreements between the US and Russia that centered around US hegemony and the desire of Russian elites to break free of that international system. These fundamental differences manifested in various ways: disagreements over US missile defenses deployed to Europe, over the fate of Assad's government in Syria, over Ukraine's position in the game of European politics. By 2016, with tensions between the two countries at their highest in decades, Russian leaders were thus primed to view US political developments with keen interest. In addition to this general failure of the Russia reset, we have to look at how Russia viewed Hillary Clinton in particular. Despite what conservative critics might claim, Hillary Clinton is neither progressive nor pacifistic. She is a liberal in the economic sense, trusting to the free market wherever possible, what's now known as a neoliberal, and a liberal hawk when it comes to foreign affairs. That is to say, she is determined to defend the unipolar world dominated by neoliberal economic doctrine and US-led institutions. And she is perfectly willing to use force in pursuance of that objective. Hence, her support for interventions in Yugoslavia, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, and Ukraine. Moreover, she did not like Putin personally and did not trust the Russian political establishment. She viewed Putin's Russia as an imperial project that stood in opposition to the US-led world system. As Obama's first Secretary of State, Clinton argued against yielding concessions to Russia, even as a goodwill measure, arguing instead for quid pro quo style negotiations. Now, she lost that debate and did work diligently to carry out the policy of her chief executive during her time in the State Department. And this professionalism initially softened the Russian view of Clinton. But this changed radically after 2011. Recall that Clinton had been a vehement supporter of US intervention in Libya at that time. Diplomacy ultimately yielded Russian acquiescence to a no-fly zone over Libya, with the understanding that regime change was not a policy objective. Gaddafi's subsequent overthrow and execution startled and enraged the Russians, who felt they'd been misled by the US in general and Clinton in particular. Her later boast,
"We came, we saw, he died,"
only added fuel to the fire of Russian anger and skepticism. As mentioned in the second part of this series, Putin also took umbrage at Obama administration comments concerning the protests that surrounded the 2012 Russian presidential election. After these elections had taken place, as protesters swelled over allegations of fraud, Clinton, speaking at a conference in neighboring Lithuania, publicly denounced apparent irregularities in the electoral process, and she described the elections as neither free nor fair and called for an investigation into allegations of fraud. Russian officials, who had grown fairly comfortable with their direct interaction with U.S. counterparts during the last few years, had not expected such harsh condemnation. Putin himself, who won re-election to the presidency at this time, seems to have come to believe that Clinton may have orchestrated the protests in an effort to overthrow him. He thus blamed her and the U.S. for the protests. Clinton also left a sour taste in Russian mouths as she left her post at the State Department. During a speech at the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe conference, Clinton declared that the Eurasian Union, Russia's proposed alternative to the EU, was little more than an attempt to re-Sovietize Eastern Europe and Central Asia. She promised to figure out effective ways to slow down or prevent the spread of this union. Coming right after a farewell dinner with the Russian foreign minister, these comments brought ire from Russian officials and did nothing to improve their view of Clinton. And she continued her harsh view of Russia after leaving the Obama administration. We've already heard in the last video her 2014 comparison of Putin with Hitler, which drew harsh criticism from the Russian president. Now, we should recall that comparisons to Hitler might hit especially hard in Russia. Nationalists like Putin may despise the Soviet Union, but they very much consider Soviet sacrifices made to stop Nazism as part of their own national heritage. She talked frequently about continuing efforts to supplant Russian energy exports with U.S. alternatives, thus threatening the fundamentals of the Russian economy. And she also promised that, if elected president, she would implement enhanced sanctions against Russia and provide more weapons to Ukraine. By 2016, therefore, Clinton came across to Russian elites as not simply a bad presidential hopeful, but probably the worst of the lot. In 2018, Putin even admitted that he preferred a Trump presidency to a Clinton one. Section 4, 2016. Some initial considerations. So after an unexpected event like the election of Donald Trump in 2016, it's easy to forget longer historical trends in favor of unprecedented and dramatic analysis. We should therefore begin our review of this election with a few mundane observations. 1. It's unusual for the same party to win 3 presidential elections in a row. 2. The slow economic recovery from the Great Recession had not yielded a huge boost in popularity for Obama or the Democrats, meaning that the electorate, especially the ever-elusive independent voter, was likely to punish the incumbent party. 3rd, growing partisan polarization meant that there were fewer voters likely to vote against party. All of this combined to yield an election in which Republicans definitely stood a chance. Indeed, it almost didn't matter who they put forth as a candidate. This was going to be a close election regardless. Now, Trump specifically benefited from 3 turns of fortune, especially in the primary season. 1. A divided Republican leadership that couldn't agree on policy positions or a presumptive nominee. This left the field open to challengers, especially those willing to voice at least seemingly heterodox views. 2. Consistent media coverage. Whether positive or negative, the media constantly covered Trump's primary adventures. Now, this gave him free advertising, a sense of legitimacy, and a platform from which to spout his rhetoric. 3, and most important, Trump openly appealed to white identity politics, especially as concerned the economy and race. Now let's delve into number 3 a little bit deeper. Contrary to popular wisdom, most Republican voters are not particularly economically conservative. They don't care so much about lower taxes for the wealthy or market forces fixing the economy. Large minorities actually support unions. Small majorities call for more taxes on the wealthy, and healthy majorities of Republican voters support funding for welfare like Social Security and Medicare. But this economic liberalism has a racial tinge to it. Government programs seem to be disproportionately doled out to the undeserving, like black people who are seen by these voters as no longer systemically discriminated against, do not find support among Republican voters. Indeed, this hostility to entitlement programs has gotten to the point where such things are often seen as part of a broader assault on white people. Couple this with fears about illegal immigrants and Muslim terrorists, and you get the racial undercurrent that propelled Trump towards the nomination. Compared to the supporters of other Republican candidates, Trump supporters were even more dissatisfied with the economy, even less conservative on economic issues, more supportive of tough immigration laws, more Islamophobic, more inclined to attribute the consequences of systemic racism to individual laziness, and identified more strongly as white people, as part of a white identity group. But in addition to these facts about Republican voters and the historical trends of the general election, we should also remember just how unlikely it was that Trump would win the Republican primary. Initially, only 7% of likely Republican primary voters supported Trump. He overcame some of this scorn through his widespread name recognition, his unconventional tactics, and his heterodox opinions, like more hardcore anti-immigration positions than most of other GOP politicians. This resulted in his lead in GOP primary polls, and he proceeded to win a slew of primaries, although failing to gain an absolute majority of votes in any primary or caucus until 2/3 of the way through the state primaries. Coming out of the primary season, he thus had an increasingly devoted, soon-to-be cultish, core of supporters, but that was far from a comfortable majority of GOP voters, and included practically no party leaders or elites. Lack of support within the existing Republican Party infrastructure and donor base would cause Trump a lot of problems during the general campaign, when he lacked a mature fundraising apparatus. Despite the fact that the general race should have been, given historical trends, a close one, Trump had several potentially fatal weaknesses. These were well understood at the time and caused most informed observers, even among Trump campaigners, to favor Clinton. 1. Before Trump, no person had been elected as President of the United States without having significant political or at least military experience. 2. Polls consistently showed that Trump was a long shot in the general election. His high unfavorability rating, 55% in June 2016, was the worst in the history of recorded polling. 3. Trump was unable to unify much of the GOP establishment behind his candidacy. Just because GOP leaders failed to stop his nomination didn't mean they had no power, especially in the realm of fundraising. 4. Critically, Trump's campaign was financially tapped out, and money gets more important with each passing election cycle. Indeed, at the start of the general election, Clinton had nearly 40 times the funds that Trump did. Instead of developing his own fundraising abilities, Trump had hitherto relied upon his own money and free media coverage to get through the primary season. This would not suffice in the general election. These weaknesses could have prompted the Trump campaign to seek out less conventional means of achieving victory. Beyond being the weaker candidate, Trump was also a businessman and a narcissist, willing to do anything to win, or at least to be perceived as having one. That he would accept foreign assistance in such a prestigious contest is not outside the realm of possibility. But why Russia specifically? As we've already established, the Russian government had strong reasons for opposing Clinton, so the Trump team wouldn't have had to twist any Russian arms to get assistance. In addition, the Trump team had some notable ties with various Russians and Russian organizations. Three of the most important were 1. Carter Page, one of his foreign policy advisors, who had worked for several years in Russia and openly described himself on multiple occasions as an informal advisor to the Kremlin. 2. Michael Flynn, a senior campaign advisor and surrogate who'd been on Trump's shortlist for vice president. In December 2015, already informally attached to the Trump campaign, Flynn spoke at a Russia Today ceremony, for which the Russian government secretly paid him $45,000. 3. Most important was Paul Manafort, for a time Trump's chief strategist and campaign manager, who remained an informal campaign advisor even after leaving his post. For years, he'd worked for Russian oligarch Oleg Deripaska, himself very closely tied to the Kremlin. Manafort had also been the campaign manager and senior advisor to former Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych, who, as we saw in the last video, had been Putin's favored candidate in both 2004 and 2010. Based on Trump's unpopularity, his poor fundraising capabilities, his lack of institutional GOP support, his narcissistic character, Russia's existing fear of Clinton, and the existing ties of Trump campaign officials to Russia, it seems quite plausible that the Trump campaign cooperated with Russian operatives in their shared goal of defeating Clinton. We should note, however, that this evidence is not conclusive, as the Mueller report makes clear. But while the Mueller report legally exonerated Trump and his team as regards active conspiracy with Russian agents, that doesn't mean that the evidence doesn't exist or that it isn't empirically substantial. It simply means that the investigators considered the evidence insufficient for a conviction in a criminal trial. Now, this isn't surprising, since conclusive, rather than suggestive, evidence for covert electoral interference often takes decades to surface. For instance, researchers are still unable to obtain some classified documents from the US government regarding its role in the Chilean election of 1964. Given the practically universal existence of domestic allies that work with and benefit from foreign election interference operations, it would be against the historical grain for the Trump team to be innocent in this regard. Well, hopefully time will reveal more answers one way or the other. So having looked at some of the evidence for collusion and some of the reasons why both Russia and Trump might want to work together in order to defeat Clinton, let's look at what Russia actually did, whether they had active help from Trump or not. Now, they attempted to interfere principally through 3 operations. Number 1, through the general dissemination of divisive news and information into the US infosphere. This was done primarily through the news outlet Russia Today, or RT, which by 2012 had become a real presence in the US news landscape. Its coverage of the 2012 presidential election made much of how little the mainline parties represented US voters, how corrupt the system was, etc.
And though the Republican versus Democrat debate held few surprises and even less diversity, that was not the case with the third-party debate. That largely ignored by the mainstream media, 4 other U.S. presidential candidates gathered together to lay out their own vastly different plans for America. Here's just a little piece of what they had to say.
The president has assumed dictatorial rights to put us in prison at his pleasure without charge or without trial.
We are on the road toward totalitarianism, and that's not an exaggeration.
The biggest threat to our national security is the fact that we're bankrupt.
RT did speak exclusively to a number of the candidates taking part in that debate. One of them, Justice Party candidate Rocky Anderson. He told RT that he would have been able to swing votes in his favor had he been allowed to challenge Obama and Romney on national television.
One thing that's clear to me is if I were included on the stage with Barack Obama and Mitt Romney, I think there would be a very different result in this country, because the range of debate between them has been so constricted. I mean, they're basically arguing about who's going to raise military spending the most, who's going to drill on public lands or offshore the most, whether we're going to send small arms or large arms to Syria and add to what's going to be, I'm afraid, an absolute bloodbath, a civil war in that country.
Now, much like the USSR highlighting legitimate human rights abuses committed by the US during the Cold War, this was an attempt to undermine an adversary with information that was both factual and fabricated. 2. The Russia-based Internet Research Agency, or IRA, carried out a social media campaign that favored Trump and disparaged Clinton. By the end of the 2016 US election, the IRA had the ability to reach millions of US citizens through various social media accounts. Facebook estimated the IRA reached as many as 126 million people through its Facebook accounts. Twitter was awash with more than 3,800 IRA-controlled accounts, masquerading as BLM protesters, state-level GOP accounts, and everything in between. Some of these accounts had large followings and even had their content retweeted by sitting US politicians. 3. The main intelligence directorate of the General Staff of the Russian Army, or GRU. They conducted computer intrusion operations against entities, employees, and volunteers, as the Mueller report put it, working on the Clinton campaign, and subsequently released whatever material they managed to collect. A basic timeline of these efforts is as follows. Starting in 2015, Russians made initial contact with members of the Trump Organization. Now, it's not clear as yet what kind of information they exchanged, any promises that were made, or any agreements that were fastened. We just know that contact was made. These people did communicate with one another. In February 2016, IRA operatives began actively supporting Trump and disparaging Clinton. In March 2016, the GRU began hacking the email accounts of Clinton campaign volunteers and employees, including campaign chairman John Podesta. In April 2016, the GRU hacked into the computer networks of the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee and the Democratic National Committee. They stole hundreds of thousands of documents from these compromised email accounts and networks. In May, members of the Trump team got word that they could benefit from Russians anonymously releasing anti-Clinton info. Again, we're not clear on what the relationship between the Trump team and the hackers was, just that the Trump team was aware that they could theoretically benefit from this stolen information. In June 2016, the Democratic National Committee and its cyber response team publicly announced that they'd been hacked by Russia, and their computer network had been compromised. At this time, the GRU began disseminating stolen materials through fictitious online personas, and they later released additional materials through WikiLeaks. On October 7th, WikiLeaks began releasing Podesta's stolen emails, less than an hour after the Access Hollywood tapes had been released. The U.S. response. The Obama administration was aware of Russian cyber capabilities as early as 2014. During the course of 2016, officials grew increasingly aware of Russian meddling in domestic U.S. politics, going so far as to formally accuse the Russians of hacking in October 2016. Despite this knowledge, they shied away from any direct confrontation or sustained effort to curb Russia's efforts. Why? Critics of the administration contended that between 2014, when Crimea was invaded, and the 2016 election, when it became clear that Russia was engaging in a global disinformation, misinformation, propaganda campaign, the Obama administration seemed to do nothing substantive to combat the threat. Now, these critics allege that this inaction was owing to a lack of interest, courage, and follow-through. Other possibilities seem more likely. First, while information warfare as a concept was nothing new, analysts consistently point to Cold War-era precedents, perpetrated by both the US and Soviet intelligence agencies. This kind of cyber warfare, hacking, trolling, Twitter bots, etc., was outside the wheelhouse of the US intelligence community. Former Director of National Intelligence James Clapper admitted that after US intelligence became convinced of direct Russian interference in the election process, quote, "We didn't have any mechanism to counter Russian efforts." At the same time, it wasn't all that clear if or how effective Russian disinformation might be. After all, it seemed clear that Russian propaganda had, from the perspective of the US government, backfired when applied to Ukraine in 2014. Few believed the Kremlin's assertions about the creation of legitimate people's republics in the Donbass. Russian efforts there just made them seem inept and conniving. Perhaps their interference in US politics would be a similar failure? Add to this possibility the fact that cyberspace is still a gray zone when it comes to geopolitics. At what point does a cyber attack become a breach of sovereignty or an act of war? Were uncharitable RT stories about American corruption worth ratcheting up international tensions? What about leaking Clinton's emails? Hacking the DNC? Wherever the line was, the Obama administration was hampered by the novelty of the threat and the lack of agreement among relevant experts as to how to respond appropriately and effectively. Partisan politics played a role as well, notably in the delays that characterized the Obama administration's public announcement of and response to Russian interference. During the initial wave of election interference, Clapper says that the US government, quote, didn't have a viable, credible path to reveal to the electorate how Russian intelligence and propaganda were attempting to manipulate them. When it subsequently became clear during the course of the 2016 primary season that the Russians were not merely disparaging Clinton but actively favoring Trump as the GOP nominee, Clapper continues, quote, "I continued to stay away from any involvement in the ongoing election shenanigans. I figured at the time that the last thing our country needed was any appearance that the intelligence community was involved in partisan politics." Jed Johnson, the former Secretary of Homeland Security, corroborated this thorny dilemma. He testified to Congress that the Obama administration feared that acknowledging Russian meddling in the 2016 election would not only reveal US intelligence gathering methodology, but risked being interpreted as taking sides in the race. After all, Trump often prophesied that the election would be rigged against him. Any action by the sitting US president to interfere with the election could easily have been seen as cover for skewing events in favor of Clinton. With these limitations in mind, the Obama administration reacted first in private, then officially but rhetorically, and finally, after the election, took more concrete steps. Top U.S. intelligence officials, including the CIA director John Brennan, privately warned their Russian counterparts not to persist with their active measures. Obama himself told Putin during an in-person meeting to desist. Obviously, these private warnings failed to make an impression. Obama then tried to get around the issue of partisanship by going to Congress. He sought congressional cooperation in issuing a joint statement on Russian election interference. While Democrats in both houses agreed to participate, Senate Republicans refused to cooperate, not wanting to make their candidate look bad, and the effort collapsed. After Election Day, Obama ordered the U.S. intelligence community to issue a public report about the Russia scheme. Once it had concluded Russia's attack was aimed at helping Trump and hurting Clinton, the United States imposed a slate of punitive measures against Moscow. In addition to new sanctions, Washington also expelled a number of Russian diplomats and closed several diplomatic compounds in the United States. The effect of Russian efforts upon the outcome of the election. After her defeat, Hillary Clinton reportedly blamed 3 acronyms for the outcome: the KKK, the FBI, and the KGB. In other words, the white identity politics of the Trump campaign, the ongoing scandal and FBI investigation surrounding her private email server, and Russian interference all caused her defeat. Leaving aside the veracity of the first two, there are plenty of reasons to be skeptical that Russian efforts had a material impact on the election. 1. The operation had been a covert one, and covert operations are usually less effective. 2. The Russian operation had been outed to the public. Such an operational failure could very well have backfired on the Russians. 3. The release of Clinton's emails in late July and in October did not clearly affect her favorability, perceptions of her honesty, or her lead over Trump. 4. Russian operatives spent far less on ads and disinformation than either presidential campaign, and there is debate as to how well those Russian efforts were targeted, and whether they were drowned out by the constant flood of digital content. 5. It's debatable what impact Russian content had on those who did view it, many of whom might have already been die-hard conservatives that would never have voted for Clinton in any case. 6. The 2016 campaign was already full of domestically sourced, rageful rhetoric and disinformation. Did Russian stories really have an impact? However, the 2016 election was very close. Trump won the Electoral College decisively, but his actual voter margin was a mere 77,744 votes in 3 key states, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan, that could have delivered the college to Clinton. The popular vote was close as well, with Clinton winning by 2.1%, far less than is typical for a presidential election. In such a close race, even a botched electoral intervention could have mattered. One in-depth analysis found that Russian interference could have cost Clinton 75 college votes, those of Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Florida. Just these 4 states were enough to make or break Clinton's victory. This analysis also reviewed pre-election survey data focusing on people's perceptions of various Russian-linked leaks. The result hints at a real and negative impact for the Clinton campaign. Finally, this analysis looked at contemporaneous Google searches for terms related to the leaked info and found a strong correlation between the timing of the leaks and popularity of terms like Clinton emails. This denotes, at the very least, that Russian efforts did help steer the U.S. conversation. The analysis concluded by suggesting that without Russian interference, Clinton could have doubled her popular vote victory margin. Accounting for state-level differences, this brings Clinton's margin of electoral college victory to 352 to Trump's 186. The 2016 election was close, and analysis of it is complicated by the bizarre dual-track system by which the U.S. selects its chief executive. Some domestic facts should not be forgotten. 1. The popular vote does not determine electoral victory. 2. Republican voter suppression efforts had been underway since 2008. 3. Clinton was not a popular candidate. 4. Media coverage of Clinton during the general election was not very positive. 5. The Clinton campaign made several major mistakes, like underestimating Trump's chances or misallocating campaign resources. 6. Since the 1990s, partisanship has been on the rise in US politics, a trend that has sharply accelerated since 2008. 7. Recovery from the Great Recession had been slow and patchy. 8. Obama's tenure was a mixed legacy, with his popularity on the rise as he left office, but very little accomplished on the hope and change front. 9. Trump adeptly played into the racially inflected economic fears of white-identified voters. We thus had a U.S. political landscape increasingly bitter, increasingly divided, increasingly unresponsive to popular pressures, and increasingly dominated by unpopular candidates. This political reality interacted with an economy that continued to siphon the labor of the many into the coffers of the few. Politics and economics mingled with a legacy of racism, prompting important sections of white voters to color their economic anxieties and their political frustrations through the lens of racial resentment towards the undeserving. All of this produced an increasing number of voters who were skeptical of the status quo and thus susceptible to messaging, both true and false, foreign and domestic, that highlighted problems with the system. In sum, there are a few things that we know with high confidence. Election interference is a common foreign policy tool. Russian leaders preferred Trump to Clinton. Trump himself, despite historical trends indicating that the 2016 election would be a close race, was a relatively weak candidate, even against a mediocrity like Hillary Clinton. Russian institutions tried to influence the outcome of the presidential election in their favor. There are other things we may not know for some time, particularly if, or to what extent, the Trump campaign coordinated with Russian interference. And given the cacophony of variables at play, we may never know how much Russian operations decided the winner of that bizarre contest. Well, if you've made it this far, thanks for watching the video. I know it was a long one. Hopefully you'll learn something about the history of election interference, or why Russia is the most evil institution ever, or something along those lines. I suppose here is as good a place as any to throw in a general conclusion to my 5-part series on Russia, a video series at this point that almost clocks in at 4 hours. So here are some concluding remarks to wrap everything up. There are many ways to assess the success or failure of a given presidential policy. One way is to ask if it met the goals set by those carrying it out. At base, every president seeks to maintain the position of the U.S. atop the global economic and military hierarchy. This is a morally dubious project, to be sure, but whether a president succeeds or fails in this regard can at least tell us how mainstream analysts should treat the legacy of a given chief executive, regardless of partisanship. So if, for instance, Jimmy Carter actually contributed to the collapse of the USSR, then any conservative who continues to lambaste him is either ignorant or selling something. Ditto holier-than-thou liberals denouncing Nixon as the Antichrist. Recall that Obama's immediate aim with the Russia reset was not to replicate the special relationship shared between the US and the UK. Rather, it was to find specific points of shared interest and strive to cooperate with Russia in those areas. The implied long-term objective of this collaboration was a consistent easing of tensions, perhaps with the ultimate aim of bringing Russia fully into the US-led international order. In the near term, Obama's policies met with real, if sometimes partial, success, but the fundamental nature of US-Russian relations remained unchanged even 8 years after Secretary Clinton pressed the big red button. During Obama's first term, his administration scored some notable diplomatic achievements. These included Russian help in supplying US forces in Afghanistan, Russia's UN delegation acquiescing to Western intervention in Libya, and Russian cooperation in sanctioning Iran. Russia also signed the New START Treaty, which, over the next decade, drastically reduced the number of deployed strategic nuclear warheads. These episodes fostered a brief softening between the two countries, which allowed Obama to push forward with his own brand of Europe-based missile defense, and prompted a degree of normalization in US-Russia trade relations. Despite these successes, tensions never entirely evaporated, because fundamentally, Russia's elites could not accommodate themselves to being treated like a second-rate power. They saw their country as one of the great powers of the world, a nation that had made spectacular contributions to human civilization. 25 million Soviets died cleansing the world of Hitler, Russians are quick to remind ignorant Westerners. This is not unique to Putin, but he harnessed the legacy and identity of the Third Rome for his own political purposes, invigorating a long-extant sense of Russian exceptionalism. This clashed with US exceptionalism, which cannot countenance a co-emperor atop the liberal empire it has led for decades. Obama's reset with Russia ultimately failed in the face of his primary foreign policy duty, maintaining US preeminence. Thus, while Russia was happy to engage with the United States as a peer partner in nuclear negotiations, in dealing with Iran's nuclear program, in fighting terrorism, its pride could not agree to missile defense installations being placed near its borders without high-level input from Russian officials. It could not tolerate its closest Middle East ally, Assad, falling to Western meddling. And it could not see Ukraine, which had been the breadbasket of the Russian Empire and an industrial hub of the Soviet Union, orient westwards. Moreover, US policymakers, if they understood the Russian position at all, saw no way to accommodate that point of view. Unlike with China, another aspirant to great power status, but one that the US has more or less been able to accommodate, at least so far, US leaders cannot help but view Russia as, at best, a has-been, and an annoyingly meddlesome one at that. This fundamental mismatch of perspective should be of critical concern to us all. Although New START succeeded in drastically reducing the number of nuclear arms within both countries, the persistent and deepening tensions between Washington and Moscow have pushed them both to modernize their existing nuclear arsenals. No good can come from this. And with that somber note, my Russia series comes to an end. All my opinions about Obama's foreign policy vis-a-vis Russia, presented for the world to see. I have nothing else to say about this topic, and will never speak of it again. If you like the video, subscribe, share, talk about it at the water cooler, watch the other videos in the series, check out the description below for sources and additional material if you're interested in this topic. You can also buy my book, He Was Our Man in Washington, A History of the Obama Years, which talks all about other aspects of the Obama presidency, his environmental impact, his relations with Indian nations, his fighting the war on terror, his dealing with the financial crisis and the economic recession, his reform of the healthcare system, so-called. All of that and more you can find within the pages of this glorious tome. Get it at your local bookstore, library, or Jeff Bezos. See you next time.